Do you remember when you first found out you were going to be a parent? Do you remember making all the plans to transition to that new life? Thinking about what it would be like once parental leave was over, yours or your partner's? Did everything go according to plan? Did you begin pumping obsessively right away or practicing with the bottle immediately once the baby was born? Did you worry about milk supply? What was your transition like after parental leave ended? Again, yours or your partner's? Today, on the Milk Making Minutes, we hear an honest story told from someone who has made it out of those early days, months, and years, and is now in a position to not only support new parents through that transition, but has made it part of her life's mission to change the conversation in workplaces around pumping and human milk feeding, to normalize this conversation so that this barrier becomes less of one, given our current state of too little parental leave. I'm thrilled to present this conversation. I hope you can overlook my poor sound quality. It was a little echoey because my mic settings were wrong. But my guest, Lori, sounds fantastic. Enjoy. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
Hi, my name is Lori Mahalik-Levin. I am joining from Washington, D.C. from my home office today. And I like to say that generally speaking, and I know we all wear like 172 hats on a given basis, but like the main three for me are that I'm mom to two wonderful redheaded boys who are now ages 9.5 and 11.5. And the halves are still important to them. Hat number 2 is that I run a program called Mindful Return that is designed to support new parents as they transition back to work after parental leave. And hat number 3 is that I'm a healthcare regulatory lawyer and nerd and sort of do the law, the practice of law as my side gig now. But I've been working as a regulatory lawyer for about 20 years now.
Let's take you back to before you were a parent yourself.
Yes.
I would love to know what your exposure to pumping, breastfeeding, human milk feeding was before it was your turn.
Yeah. So I know for a fact that I was breastfed as a child, but I don't think I ever thought about it really until I became pregnant. And I mean, I watched a colleague in the office next to mine disappear into her office and heard the a few times a day as she went through it. But like in that interval between me being breastfed and me working in an office next to someone pumping, like probably zero thought really given to it. I think when I got pregnant was a time when I was sort of not forced to, but it was on the list of things that I was told I should start thinking about. How are you going to feed the baby, right? Everybody needs to eat. How are you going to do it? And it was definitely encouraged that I consider breastfeeding.
You had this colleague who you heard the pump going at work.
Yes.
And then did you have any other peers that you actually saw feeding babies along the way, or family members?
Perhaps. Now I'm sort of like reflecting on a family member who I saw disappear into another room to feed, but not, breastfeed in front of me. And occasionally I live in Washington, D.C. And so there will be people who are, feeding out in public, but with a cover up on, for example. But no, not really.
Yet again, another guest who had what amounts to no exposure to seeing other people feed their babies from their bodies growing up or as a young adult before it was her turn. This is why it is so important that we all feel comfortable feeding our babies anywhere and everywhere. We don't just do this for ourselves and our babies. We do this for every person coming after us who may decide to feed their baby from their breast or chest in the future. We struggle more, so they will struggle less. As Lori discusses being in a white, male-dominated field, think of your own experiences in the workplace. Were you in a position to be able to make change? Some of us are, and some of us are not. Some of us have the energy to tackle that, and some do not. There is no shame here, only reflection. We all give the best we can at any given time. But I am so thankful for the Loris of the world who push the needle forward.
When you realize that your first up-close experience of feeding a baby, of seeing a baby fed, is your own,
Yes.
of course it's going to be challenging. And in places where it's just a part of the air, all the time, everywhere, from your earliest moments,
Yeah.
it is not as challenging.
Yes. And it is not in the air of a white male dominated law firm. I have to
No.
say, that's not where I
No.
was at the time when I had my babies. But, you know, I've worked in law firms and been a partner at law firms. And one thing that I love to do when I'm talking to partners at law firms is saying, it's human to need to eat, and this is how babies eat. So we're going to talk about it because it's human. And that is
Yes.
very unsettling to people in a different generation who don't want to even look at the subject. Anyway.
I love that. And I love that you're being a squeaky wheel there, because it is so important for generations coming behind us who want to both have fulfilling careers and fulfill their desire to be parents.
Yes.
And do it in a way that feels good to them and not have to make tough choices about how they feed their babies for their own mental health. Yeah. And right now, people do have to make many tough choices, and that's okay. You know, if you have to make a different choice about how to feed your baby because that's what's best for your mental health, that is great. You should do that. And people are suffering because of those choices. Yeah. So these questions, exploring these ideas, so many times I've asked this question and they've been like, oh yeah, you know, like, no, I never saw it. I never saw feeding. I never saw a baby feeding at a breast. And then they'll go on to tell me all the times that they either participated in or saw formula feeding.
Yeah.
You know, helped a baby.
I babysat.
Yeah.
As
and
a
definitely
teenager.
Knew how to mix a bottle of formula. That was
for sure. Yeah. And, you know, come to think of it, I did take a breastfeeding class with my husband at the local hospital when I was pregnant. And I admit that it's just hard to make it real when it's just slides on a screen, right? I mean, it's sort of hard to internalize it and know what the person's actually referring to. All those words about just even like getting a letdown. What is that? That meant nothing to me when the person explained it until I actually like felt it and experienced it for myself.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of thinking about this because since I've started this podcast, I hear a lot of mixed feelings about these classes. We know that prenatal education and support is important. There are studies that show this. But what I'm hearing from people is that they walk away from those classes with very mixed feelings, especially after having experienced trying to feed a baby. And so what is that balance in that class? Yes. What is the most effective approach to that prenatal education? And what I've been hearing from people is when they walk away from that class feeling like, I know who I'm going to call.
Yes.
When and
there's
if
an issue.
I need somebody. Right.
No, I love that framing. Yeah. That does feel like the most effective middle ground for sure. I remember walking away from the birth class at the same hospital and sitting in the car and just like crying, sobbing hysterically because I had never really thought deeply about all the things that could go wrong that were presented to me in the however long we spent together. So how you feel when you leave one of those classes, I think is the critical measure of whether it was successful or not.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so you took a breastfeeding class. You had heard this colleague
Yes.
pumping. Any other things that you did to prepare or goals that you set for yourself
I
in
mean,
that?
a sister-in-law of mine who ultimately wound up, I believe, not breastfeeding or did it for a little bit, gave me all of her pump parts and supplies and whatever. And we can talk about whether or not one should be sharing pumps and whatever. But she gave me a bunch of her stuff, and then the colleague next door also passed along a lot of her supplies. So
Uh-huh.
I felt when the baby was born, like, okay, I got all the stuff. I really don't even know how to connect it or what all these parts are meant to do, but I have it all. So I felt a little like, okay, when I'm ready to start doing this, at least I'll have the tools to be able to do it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so you felt supported by them. Did they pass on any tips or any information or any of their feelings about what it was like for them, or they just kind of gave you the stuff?
They just gave me the stuff. Yes. And after I got into the world of pumping, um, my colleague next door to me revealed different things to me that, gosh, I wish I had known earlier in the pumping journey. It wasn't until after I stopped pumping and had a really hard time from a mental and emotional perspective with the end point that I talked to her and was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm feeling so depressed." And she was like, "Oh my gosh, I went through that too." But she never told me that she had also gone through that.
Mm.
And, at one point she was like, "Oh yeah, you got to swap out the membranes on the pump like every now and then," because I was really struggling to get suction. And I was like, "Goodness gracious, I wish I had known that I couldn't use the same ones for 12 months or whatever."
Yeah.
So yes, the information was there, but we weren't having a lot of open conversations about it.
Yeah, and your children were 11 and 9. So
Yeah,
did you have a pump passed on to you or just the parts? Because this was pre
both.
Affordable Care Act.
It was pre-Affordable Care Act, and I had both passed on to me. I had multiple pumps passed on to me, and so I was in the very fortunate position of having a pump at work and one at home, so I didn't have to lug it back and forth
Okay. And
with me.
both
Yeah,
had been used by somebody previously. So
that
you
is
did,
accurate.
okay.
Yes.
You did some preparation. You came out of that birth education course crying. Did they touch on breastfeeding in that class or did they
I don't
focus?
remember. I think they sent
Okay.
us to another session. I mean, it
Okay.
was sort of a series of
Uh-huh.
classes, one of which was focused on breastfeeding.
Okay. And there was just this feeling of everything that could go wrong in birth. Is that what
Yes.
was
That's
overwhelming
what I
you?
walked away with, was like, they spent way a lot of the time talking about various interventions that might be necessary as opposed to what the normal course of events would probably be. Or my
Yeah.
anxious brain really just focused on those and made it feel as though that was what they spent the whole time on. I don't know.
I always encourage people to go with their instincts about, what their first thought is about why they were feeling a certain way in a
Uh-huh.
situation.
Yes.
And, your anxious brain was probably picking up on signals that were being given to it.
Yes. Yes. Fair. Hmm.
So some of us tend to get more anxious than others, myself included, but
Hmm.
you were not being given safety signals in that environment.
That's fair. Yes.
Um, so it was not, we tend to blame ourselves. It was not
Hmm.
your fault. It
Thank
was
you
not
for
your
that
fault.
reframe, Lo. Thank
No.
you. Yes.
So in your mind, was there anything that did happen at the birth that impacted breastfeeding either positively or negatively?
I think positively, actually. I mean, I
Okay.
had a vaginal delivery, I did have an epidural, and there was like immediate skin to skin contact. There was a clear emphasis on, honoring my desire to breastfeed right away. There were people around who were encouraging it. And with my first child, and by we, I mean my tiny baby and I were just fumbling around, right? Not knowing what we were doing. And it turned out that my son, I guess, was just having trouble getting a latch. And we were just having a rocky, maybe 12 hours, the first 12 hours. And the nurses were getting concerned that they claimed he hadn't peed within a certain amount of time, and they were getting worried about that. It turns out that he did pee and they just wrote it somewhere else and then didn't find the piece of paper where it was written or whatever. But we, kept insisting that we did want to keep breastfeeding. We didn't want to do formula right away. And the lactation consultant at the hospital came by. And I sort of view her with these like angel wings because she came in.
Oh, good.
And she looked at me and she looked at my baby and he was just screaming his lungs out. And she goes, "Oh," she was Irish. She goes, "Oh, dearie, it looks like he's gone off the plot." And I was like, "Gone off the plot? I've never heard that expression before." And she goes, "Just put his little head right here and he will find it." And I was like, "He'll find what? He'll find the food?" And she was like, "Just trust me." And she like just sat there and watched. And that little head wiggled itself down my chest and found the milk and he latched on beautifully. And it was just like someone coming in saying, "You two can figure this out and I'm going to make sure you do." And like, that was what we needed to get started off on the right foot. So she was amazing.
Amazing.
Yes.
And so that was after that 12-hour time or before?
My sense of time is very warped.
I know.
I don't know. I don't know. I was in labor for 22 hours, so I don't really know at what point all of this happened, but it was definitely when I was in recovery and not in the labor and delivery room anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the nurses were at this point worried, and
they were concerned, and they were conveying that concern. And in fact, one of them brought formula into the room and was like, "We're worried, here's the formula." And I was like, no. Oh, I forgot this part, but they had me, I guess, just hand expressing some milk onto a spoon that they were trying to maybe give him through a little spoon. But it took the lactation consultant to come in and like, we never had any problems after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, you had this little rocky start, but this angel came in.
Yes.
He's gone off the plot. I love that. I've never heard that either. But,
I get what it means. And yes, right. He had gone off the plot, and I've used that with him ever since. Oh, looks like he's gone off the plot.
Yeah, but then you got to see him do this little head bob and use that biologically wiggle. Yeah. Coming to the breast on his own, which is pretty amazing when you get to witness that.
That was magical. Yeah.
When I asked Lori if she had any challenges in the early days, she mentioned having cracked nipples in the first couple of weeks, which resolved very quickly and which she did not need to seek out additional help for. When it comes to cracked nipples, it can be tricky to know how to advise folks because so many people think it is, quote, normal. If you consider normal a synonym of common, then we could say cracked nipples are normal. But having cracked nipples is an indication that something needs to be improved with the latch or the positioning to help the baby get more of the mammary tissue in their mouth. Sometimes, with time and practice, this resolves on its own. Sometimes it doesn't. Did you have cracked nipples? Were you told it was normal? How did they resolve? The other major struggle Lori mentioned was perceived low milk supply, which so many people can relate to. Here's what she said about this.
My struggle or perceived struggle in the first couple of months really was, am I making enough milk? And clearly, ultimately, I was. I've got a strapping healthy boy who's been strapping and healthy since the beginning. And I went through the cluster feeds from 7 to 11 p.m. where he just wouldn't stop feeding. And that was something I was sort of unprepared for at the time.
Yeah. And were your early experiences with your second son pretty similar to the first?
No. With baby number 2, he arrived on the scene, he latched, or I knew how, whatever, and we were off to the races from the beginning, and I had massive milk supply, and I just I don't know, none of those issues were there. And it had to, in part, had something to do with my experience level, my relaxation about the whole thing. I knew how it worked. I was chill about it. I was worried about a 2-year-old who was potty training and running around and had the baby. So I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot to say about the story with my second, who arrived on the scene in 5 hours instead of 22 from labor and
Whoa.
just like started eating immediately. And so,
Uh-huh. Okay.
that's the
So a
snippet
lot
from
less
him.
worry, a lot less
Yes.
anxiety, overabundant milk pretty early on. Like,
Yes. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Within days.
yes. Yes.
Okay.
And our breastfeeding journey continued just fine until, he weaned a little after a year, and it was just pretty uneventful.
So you went back to work at what
Yeah.
time with both of your children?
Right. So with my first son, I was home for 20 weeks. And with my second son, I was home for 16. So about
Okay.
5 months and about 4 months. And I started a childcare transition a few weeks before I went back.
Okay. And
Just
what type of childcare did you choose for
a
your
daycare
kids?
center that was a few blocks from our house.
Paint this picture of what it was like for you and how you became so interested in helping other people do this with as little anxiety as
Yes.
possible.
Yeah. So I was a wreck upon returning with my first son, in part because he would not take a bottle. And I was fairly certain that I was going to like starve my son and kill him if I went back to work, and that wasn't going to work out for the family. Um what I discovered through research and taste testing was ultimately that I did have an excess supply of, or an excess lipase in my breast milk. And
Mhm.
so over time, through experimentation, I learned that if I pumped the milk and then scalded it within 4 hours after pumping it, that then ultimately he would take it. But he had a fair amount of like bottle trauma from the early days from drinking milk that was, in retrospect, quite not tasty, to put it mildly. And I had the trauma of my husband having to throw away a lot of frozen milk that I had stashed to prepare for going back to work. Um, Once I figured this out, once the daycare worked with him on understanding that good, wonderful, delicious stuff could come out of a bottle, we got on a better page, and I just had a pumping experience that involved pumping and scalding at every time. So I would pump, and then I'd have what looked like a little science experiment under my desk going on with a bottle warmer and a candy thermometer, scalding my milk after each pump session. So it was a very intense labor of trying to make sure I was properly feeding my baby and that he was going to be healthy, and trying to navigate all the return to work issues that one faces upon leaving one's child, and navigating like trying to get back into projects and all that. So that was probably the most stressful thing with baby number one. Yeah.
Yeah. And how much frozen milk was thrown out? Do you know?
Probably 100 ounces.
Hmm. Yeah. And how long had you been pumping that milk in anticipation of going back to work?
My whole maternity leave.
So, like,
I
you had
mean,
started pumping
I
pretty early on.
I did. Yeah. I would pump like after a feeding session. I would try to get a pump session in like once each night, so that I could have a couple of ounces here and there. I was perhaps a little compulsive about how much milk I thought I needed to have in the freezer. Um, and then it was all gone. And I'll note that my son is 11 and a half and, weighs 100 pounds and like he's fine and healthy and all those things. And at the time, I was sure he was going to die. I also want to say that the other stressful thing was that I felt as though I could not leave my baby. And that for me was also really hard, because I felt like his entire existence is dependent on me and not being able to just even get away for an hour and a half, longer than however long he was between feedings, was mentally stressful at the time.
How did you finally determine that it was a high lipase issue?
Um, Oddly enough, my husband picked up the bottle and said to my son, who's sort of joking around, like, "Sweet, it's a bottle. It has yummy milk in it." And my husband put the bottle into his mouth and took a couple of sips and was like, "Oh my God, like, what is this?" And he spat it out. And I was like, "What are you talking about? I've tasted my own milk. It tasted totally fine." And I'm like, yeah, when I express it, it tastes totally fine. So I started Googling, bad tasting breast milk, which led me to some websites that talked about lipase and how it can cause the milk to turn sour. So I sat there and conducted a taste test at half-an-hour intervals for the, a couple of hours. And at the 4-hour mark after milk was pumped, that's when it started tasting a little tinny and off. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm. The
Yeah.
things we do.
The things we do. Right.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I also want to reflect that I wasn't getting encouraged to quit.
I'm so glad.
I was, however, being told you could supplement with formula and take some of the pressure off. And I wouldn't even do that. And if I had it to do over again, I might have just calmed down and listened a little bit more to a little bit of flexibility and not been so rigid, because I had this idea that if I introduced any formula whatsoever, it was a slippery slope, and then that was the end, and blah, 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 blah. And I talked myself into a state where I drove myself to the edge in service of this thing where I think I went a little too far.
If you were listening to this and you were thinking, yes, I am very familiar with driving myself too far to the edge. I'm driving myself crazy in trying to make milk for my baby and trying to be the perfect human milk feeding parent, the perfect breastfeeding mom. And you think you could use the help of a compassionate lactation professional who can help you protect your milk supply and also make decisions that are best for your family as you come up with a plan that helps preserve your mental health and get you to a place where you're feeling really good about feeding your baby and helping you to feel a little less anxiety about producing the milk that your baby needs to eat. Then you can reach out to me. I would love to be the person that provides my expertise of lactation and human milk supply to your expertise of your unique situation and your baby, so that you can come up with a plan that really makes you feel good. You can reach out to me by emailing lo@quabbinbirthservices.com, or you can go to my website, www.quabbinbirthservices.com. We can meet virtually, or if you live in Massachusetts or southern New Hampshire or southern Vermont, if you prefer, we can meet in person. And in many cases, I can bill your insurance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a hard balance. Oh my goodness. So can you tell us what this little science experiment looked like underneath your desk?
Yeah.
Did you have your own? You had your own desk, right?
I had my own desk. I had my own office, which I recognize is a major privilege. I get that. It had a door that shut and windows I was able to pull shades on. And so I was able to pump in my office. And the science experiment, I had the pump and whatever. And then when I was done pumping, I had a Munchkin bottle warmer, because I needed a bottle warmer that didn't have an auto shutoff valve. And the only one that I could find was this Munchkin one, because I needed it to go up to the temperature it needed to go to. So I had the Munchkin bottle warmer with water in it, right? I had the bottle full of the milk, and then I had one of those tall candy thermometers, like the silver ones with a round top on it. And I had to wait until the milk got to, I believe it was 160 degrees, and keep it there for 15 to 20 seconds. And then, I could shut off the bottle warmer and cool down the milk and put it in the refrigerator down the hallway, which was like, this not walk of shame, but just like, okay, go hide the thing before nobody knows what I'm carrying around in the hallway sort of scene. Yes. And then so every time I went on work travel, I had to bring with me not just all my pump and my pump parts, but the bottle warmer and the candy thermometer, which, I had to clean. And I just remember being like in airport bathrooms, scalding milk with a candy thermometer and a thing like plugged in on the sink and the counter of a public bathroom in an airport. Like it was wild.
And how often were you traveling for work?
Often enough to have some memories of it.
Right. Yeah.
I probably went somewhere once every 2 to 3 months, and it wasn't long trips. It was a couple of it was 2 nights at a time or something like that. The first work trip
Mhm.
I took was 1 night. It was 36 hours. I had like bawled my eyes out on the way there. I literally pumped in my seat in the airplane.
Uh-huh.
But then for the remainder of my pumping or my breastfeeding journey, I did have the luxury really of bringing my husband and baby with me on work trips because my
Okay.
husband works for himself. So I was able to avoid a lot of the pumping scene by bringing the under 2-year-old who didn't cost anything extra to bring onto the airplane. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of the working parents who I talk to now, I encourage them to consider a lot of different options for work travel. One of which is there are companies that will ship your breast milk home, and some companies provide it as a parental leave benefit to have your milk shipped, or not a parental leave benefit, but just an employee benefit. So that's an option. Another option is, to bring a nanny or a parent or a family friend or whatever with you, right, to help out with the baby. And then another option that I've seen people use is there are backup childcare providers that are located, across the US. And there are also ways of finding childcare in the destination so that you can bring baby, continue to breastfeed, and not have to pump as much, and have a caregiver there sort of, in the place where you are going for work travel. So I think there are a lot of options to explore. And some employers are even willing to pay to have the extra person sort of go on the trip with you to avoid the childcare costs.
Yeah, they're willing to do that because they would rather do that than pay for the full, you know, year or 2 years that we
Well,
should
there's
be
that.
getting
Yes,
for
exactly.
parental leave.
We started off with systemic problems. There are many, many systemic problems in the work world. Yes, there's that issue. But
Right.
given the system
Yeah.
that we're living in, yes, they're
Right.
willing to make some accommodations.
Did you have the lipase issue again the second time around?
I did, yes.
Okay.
But I knew what to look out for, and I just did the whole scalding thing again. I guess the only thing that I would note, sort of continuing on the theme of how different my experience was between baby number 1 and baby number 2, is that with my first baby, I really struggled to eke out every ounce and pumped 3 times a day at work. And with baby number 2, I had learned that it was helpful for me to block pumping times on my work calendar, like a year
Mhm.
out, basically, so that it was just sort of already in there. But with baby number 2, I only needed 2 out of the 3 pump sessions that I scheduled for my day, which was dramatically
Hmm.
different than for the first time around because I just had so much of a different supply. So, what I try to tell people is don't assume that your experience will be the same with a second or subsequent child as was for the first, because I kept this is my little secret, but I kept the pumping time on my calendar that I was not using and just used it to pause and have lunch and like have some time alone.
Yeah.
Um, but I didn't need to use it for pumping in the same way that I did for the first baby.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I know that you work in a male dominated field or
Hmm.
at least in a male dominated office. And you mentioned, I can't remember if it was before we hit record or not, but you mentioned trying to bring people along and just be
Yes.
open about pumping. Whereas some people tend to kind of put the blinders on, not talk about it, not make a scene. So,
Yeah.
do you want to talk a little bit
I
about
would.
how you've tried to change your culture where you are you still working at the same place that you did those years
No, I'm
ago? Or
not. I now
okay.
have my own law firm. I mean, I've made different career shifts since then. Um, And what I'd say is, I think you have to walk into a situation like centering on your values around wanting to pump and believing in your heart of hearts that you have permission from the universe to do this. Because you can walk into an office and your boss is, 50-year-old white guy partner might say, we have a meeting from 9 until 12 and like nobody can leave. And like, this is a critical client meeting and you need to pump. And so I think you need to get into a space yourself to be able to say, I need to take this break from this time to this time. It is normal for humans to eat. My baby needs to eat at the same intervals that I would feed them. And like, this is what it will require. Um, and really sort of assert what you need and be able to articulate it rather than be scared of articulating it.
My baby doesn't care about this important client. I'm
Right.
sorry.
Yeah. Their slippery slope is real because if you start skipping, then your own supply starts to decrease and then it gets harder and harder to assert that boundary for yourself.
Mhm.
And so I'll just put a note in about my very favorite boundary setting quote, which is from Brene Brown, which is choose discomfort over resentment, right? So I would prefer that you feel a little uncomfortable about raising the issue of taking a break so you can go breastfeed, rather than you feeling resentful that you weren't able to stop and now you're in pain and you're harming your breastfeeding journey, et cetera. But I do a lot of training for managers and partners at firms and things like that. And I try to explain to them, like, they don't understand that it's a supply and demand system. Like, they don't really get what is going on. And so I think if we can demystify it and say the word breastfeeding out loud a few 100,000 times and just make it part of the normal conversation that one has around parenthood, then we can say, like, it's not something to be scared of talking about. Yes, there are a lot of opinions and emotions around it for new parents. And so you might say to your direct report, like, if you're pumping or if you are breastfeeding, let me know what you need and how I can support you. So you're not making assumptions about whether they are or aren't breastfeeding. But then if they are, make the window open for them to say, hey, I need this and this. And like, can you help me accommodate it? And just explaining to these people, I say these people, the people who might not have had experience with breastfeeding, how it works, and that it's just about food and it's just about eating, and you need to eat and I need to eat, and so does my baby, I think can help normalize the conversation and make it something that's just less scary to talk about in a work setting. There's a sense that it's just not professional to bring it up. And I say that's crap. It's just part of life.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And I love the idea of demystifying what's happening and just bringing some compassion to that conversation. That manager might truly just not understand that it's about supply and demand, that person who's trying to get milk out of their body truly cannot wait another hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because then their milk supply will decrease.
Yes.
Over
Yes. And I had a colleague, I recall, who approached a building supervisor. It was a brand new building and the pump room wasn't ready yet. And I remember her saying to this like construction supervisor, so would you open up a building if there were no place for you to go to the bathroom? Because that's sort of what it feels like. Whenever you need to pee desperately, you need to pump desperately. So she sort of turned it into this analogy where that he could relate to. And he was like, oh, I didn't realize it was sort of that urgent, you know?
Yeah. I love
So
that.
putting it into words that the person can understand and relate to can help.
Right. And not only that, you can get really sick, the same way you can get a UTI if you're holding in your pee all the time. You can get mastitis if you're not relieving the milk. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh man, I love that. So, tell us a little bit more about some of the ways that you support working parents. You've given some of these great strategies. What are some of the resources that you have out there for people?
Yeah, thank you, Lo. So I did write a book called Back to Work After Baby that is all about sort of navigating that transition from a personal, emotional, and logistical perspective. When I went back, I mean, I found lots of resources focused on baby, but not any that were focused on my own identity transition that I was going through as a working parent. And so I really set out to create what I wished had existed. The program I run, Mindful Return, runs a 4-week online sort of community-based cohort class every other month. And people join it from all over, and they're all returning to work from leave around the same time. And we walk them through 4 different main topics. One is a mindful mindset for going back to work after parental leave, sort of how to get your head in a better place. The second week is all about the logistics, whether how you're feeding your baby or negotiating your schedule or managing the transition to childcare, all the logistical stuff. The third week is all about leadership in the space of return and focusing on all the skills that we gain through parenthood that make us better in our careers and make us even more amazing leaders. And then the fourth week and fourth theme is all about building and staying in community. So you're not isolating yourself and crying on the kitchen floor like I did alone, thinking I was the only person struggling with this return. And so we have programs for new moms, we have programs for new dads, we have programs for parents of special needs children who are trying to manage, balancing work and a special needs child. So we really, we have a lot of employers that offer our programs as parental leave benefits, and therapists and doulas and things that also refer people in individually to take our courses as well.
Oh, that's amazing. And at what time, if somebody's thinking about returning to work?
Yeah.
at what part in their maternity or paternity leave do you recommend that they start your course?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer differently for moms and dads. So for moms, we find that the best time to participate in the program is when you are mid leave and the anxiety is really starting to spike about your return. So
Hmm.
baby has already arrived and like you got some the logistics down. Um, Even we have about 2/3 of the people who take it while they're on leave, and then about a third of the people who take it within the first 6 months after they return. Some people say, yeah, the return will be fine. I'll figure it out. And then a few months in, they say, well, actually, it might be helpful if I had a community around me to sort of guide me through this. On the father
Once they get
side,
back.
um, a lot of the people who join the course join after baby has arrived. We recommend starting as soon as you know you're going to be a father, though, because we have a whole section of lessons around how to normalize the conversation in your workplace about taking paternity leave. Because, as I'm sure you know, culturally, we're just not there yet in terms of having it be a normal thing for the father to take the full amount of leave. And so, if you can get yourself some support and some encouragement and confidence in those conversations, then it can help with the rest of your journey. And
Okay.
we're on all the usual social media channels. I do a Tuesday tip for working parents every Tuesday on Instagram and just,
Oh, fun.
all the usual usuals.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you also have a podcast?
Yes, my husband and I co-host a podcast called Parents at Work, in which we interview moms and dads in different roles, industries, sectors. So we'll do, parents in the arts. We just did parents who are diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals, and we talked to moms and dads who all do diversity work. We've done lawyers, we've done accountants and engineers, and we love hearing their perspectives on what it's like to be a parent in that particular industry.
So is it always a couple in the same industry?
It's not a couple. No, we pick 2
Oh,
moms and 2 dads, who
okay.
are not related to each other, and we try to
Okay.
have them not also like 2 moms be from different companies or different employers or whatever so that they can bring some
Okay.
varied perspectives. Yeah, so that in general, we'll wind up with 4 people who all work in that industry or that role who are parents and what it is like to be in that role.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Awesome.
I also just remembered, I do have a weekly newsletter called Saturday Secrets for Working Parents, and it comes out on Saturdays at 6 a.m. And every week we address sort of a short Q&A related to working parenthood. And you can sign up for it via our website. We also have a document called 99 Questions to Ask Yourself Before, During, and After Maternity Leave, or parental leave, I think it is now, that you can get on mindfulreturn.com as well.
Okay, great. Okay, so we'll link all of those resources in the show notes so
Thank
people
you.
can find them and find you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your stories. I think there are so many nuggets here.
Thank you for having me. I loved our conversation, Lo.
From the angel who walked into the hospital room at just the right moment, who said just what Lori needed to hear, to the devastating story of throwing away so much frozen milk due to the issue of having high lipase in her milk, to hearing how Lori carved out pumping time for herself and put it on the calendar at work. It is so important to hear how other people grapple with the changing identity in our earliest moments of becoming parents and learning how to feed our babies. So many of us have grappled with our identity and how it shifts when we become parents, and how we would manage making milk for our babies and continue in careers we love. And given that one of the biggest structural and cultural barriers to milk making is that none of us get enough paid time off to make milk for our babies for a full 1 to 2 years, many of us must figure out a way to feed our babies and work simultaneously. I would love to know how you have managed this. If you are a lactation professional or a doula or a birth professional, I would love to know how you help your clients to manage this. Join my Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook and let's talk about it. I can't wait to see you there.